Whether you like the movie or not, there can be no denying that Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi did immense damage to Star Wars. Regardless of whether or not the rise of Skywalker succeeds in mitigating that damage, it will be followed by a hiatus from the big screen, while the Star Wars brand is reduced to a means to push the digital streaming service Disney+. Star Wars will eventually return to the big screen though, and we know of 2 projects Disney are considering to that end. One is a new trilogy by Rian Johnson, the one filmmaker very few wants to see involved with Star Wars ever again. The other is a new trilogy by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, the showrunners of Game of Thrones. Now that is something that has fans much more excited, because Game of Thrones rules. At least it used to, up until a few seasons ago. But now, following episodes 3 and 4 of the 8th and final season, the most recent episodes at the time of making this video, many are increasingly of the opinion that Game of Thrones has ceased to rule altogether. As showrunners, Benioff and Weiss essentially pulled a Last Jedi on the series. In this video, which will not feature any Game of Thrones spoilers to speak of, I will nonetheless address its general shortcomings over the last couple of seasons, and the particular technical and creative shortcomings in the last few episodes, and what this might mean for the future of Star Wars, should the Benioff and Weiss trilogy be given the green light. For those who might not have seen it, Game of Thrones is based on A Song of Ice and Fire, the series of epic fantasy novels by the American writer George R.R. Martin. So far, 5 of a total of 7 planned novels have been written and released. After a rough start, in which the pilot effectively had to be filmed twice, the TV series adaptation Game of Thrones, named after the first book in the series, has gone from strength to strength, captivating audiences across the world, single-handedly making HBO a force to be reckoned with in the streaming wars. Showrunners Benioff and Weiss basked in the glory, as several of their directors were offered big-budget feature films. They themselves were offered a possible Star Wars trilogy, and no less than 5 separate spin-off series were considered, 3 of which are still in some level of development. But all of this success was based on Martin's Song of Ice and Fire books, meaning the blueprint for the success was already there. All Benioff and Weiss had to do was make the right decisions in what to adapt and how to adapt it. Now, I have never read any of the books myself, and I am at best a casual fan of the series. But from what I gather by those more into it than myself, Benioff and Weiss, despite some blunders here and there, overall did a fair job while they still had books to adapt. But starting from season 5 onwards, they started running out of published source material. From there on out, they increasingly had to rely on the outlines they had been provided of where the story would go in the 2 novels that had yet to be completed, let alone published. In season 7 and 8, those outlines were all they had. Now that's a new situation for the showrunners, because rather than having to subtract material from the published novels, they now had to invent it. Rather than having the course staked out for them, they now had to plot it out, at least to a larger extent than before. As such, season 7 and 8 is where the training wheels came off, and where Benioff and Weiss could demonstrate to the audience how far they have come as showrunners, and to Hollywood what they can do as filmmakers. Before we move on to Benioff and Weiss' take on Game of Thrones, and how that might inform their take on Star Wars, allow me to digress for a moment and talk about Dexter. Bear with me, it is relevant to the topic at hand, I promise. Unlike Game of Thrones, I actually was heavily emotionally invested in Dexter, the Showtime crime thriller based on the books by Jeff Lindsay. The series ran for a total of 8 seasons, and the first half or so of them were by and large great. At this time, I did not follow any behind-the-scenes machinations, I was just a fan. But even as a mere viewer, I still noticed that something was amiss from the very first episode of season 6. I couldn't quite put my finger on it right away, but it got worse and worse for not just the rest of the season, but for the rest of the series, as it undid everything great that had come before. Undercut storylines years in the making, didn't address important questions that needed answering, before culminating with what is widely regarded as the worst series finale of all time. It was so bad that I couldn't believe what I was watching. It seriously came off as low-grade fan fiction trying to come off as monumental, but which failed spectacularly. It still gets me riled up just thinking about it, so I evidently still haven't gotten over it. After witnessing that shockingly bad finale, I researched what could have gone so wrong with a series that was so good just a few seasons prior. Naturally, it was a change behind the scenes. Scott Buck had joined the series as a writer already in the great Season 2, but from Season 6 onwards, he was promoted to showrunner. He had the outline of where the initial showrunners, the ones who made the series great to begin with, wanted the series to not just go, but ultimately how to end. But Scott Buck deviated more and more from this outline as time went along. I don't know if he just thought his ideas were better, or if he deliberately wanted to subvert expectations, but the end result was nonetheless that he turned one of the best series on TV into one of the very worst. He landed on his feet though, as after Dexter, he got a sweet gig with a certain Disney-owned company. I can only imagine that Marvel's Jeff Loeb must have been impressed with him writing for and even serving as showrunner for the great Dexter. And yes, he was there while Dexter was great, but when left to his own devices, when actually put in charge of where the story would go, Scott Buck brought Dexter down into the gutter. Jeff Loeb evidently did not do sufficient due diligence, for he appointed Scott Buck as showrunner of not just Iron Fist, but of the Inhumans as well. It shouldn't be necessary to point out how well that worked out, because it didn't. It really, really didn't. Now, let's get back to how this relates to Game of Thrones and to Star Wars. Unlike Scott Buck, who was there before and then suddenly was put in charge of Dexter, Benioff and Weiss had been in charge of Game of Thrones the whole time. But when they ran out of finished novels to adapt, and were instead left with outlines that they were free to choose what to do with, they were in much the same boat that Scott Buck was in when he was elevated from writer to showrunner on Dexter. As a viewer and a casual fan that could not tell you where Martin's original writing ends and Benioff and Weiss' contributions begin, I still noticed that something was amiss. Well, honestly, already from Season 5, but especially from Season 7 onwards, where it was as noticeable as it was with Dexter that something had happened behind the scenes, and it manifested itself in borderline fanfic appearing on screen. I did not much enjoy Season 7 of Game of Thrones, and I did not much look forward to Season 8 for the same reason, because how were they going to resolve all the open plotlines in just 6 episodes? After seeing the first 2 episodes of pure filler, I was even more worried, because now, how were they supposed to resolve all these still open plotlines, some of which looked like they needed whole seasons all of their own, in now just 4 episodes? Even so, all this time, I was actually excited about the prospect of Benioff and Weiss taking on a Star Wars trilogy all of their own. Then I saw the 3rd episode of Season 8, Battle of Winterfell. That's when I sold all stock in Benioff and Weiss. Although they are immense, I will not go too much into the creative failures of this episode. For that, I will refer you to Nerdrotic and Doomcock, both of whom are fans of the series and familiar with the source material, and therefore can comment on those creative failures with far more authority and passion than I. Suffice to say though, Benioff and Weiss must have deviated from the outline they were provided by Martin, as they chose the person to dispatch of the Night King not based on what had been set up and built towards for the better part of a decade, but on what they thought would come as the biggest surprise to the audience in the moment. To borrow a phrase from Rian Johnson, they wanted to subvert expectations. Well, they sure subverted the expectations of everyone who thought the Night King and his army of the dead were anything like the threat they were cracked up to be. Beyond the creative failures, that episode also had technical failures of epochal proportions. As has been widely published, the episode was so dark and the image so filled with artifacts that one could not see what was going on for most of the extended running time. The worldwide backlash to this was such that the episode's cinematographer Fabian Wagner actually responded to the complaints via TMC, and what he said is just too staggering not to comment on. First and foremost, the article's introduction makes it clear it wasn't his fault, so distancing right off the bat. Fabian went on to say they shot the episode right. It only appeared too dark and filled with artifacts due to the compression HBO does to get the file size down to manageable levels for streaming, as well as poor internet connections. This point is not without merit. The movies and TV series you get by way of streaming may technically be high definition, but they are so bitrate starved that quality suffers. If you want actual high-definition entertainment, you are much better off sticking with physical media than any streaming service out there. That aside, he also maintained that Game of Thrones should not be seen on a mobile or in a lit room, but on a big screen TV in an as dark a room as possible. That's fair enough, I guess, but I distinctly remember watching the epic nighttime battle sequences in Lord of the Rings on VHS, on a medium-sized cathode ray tube TV, in daylight, and I still had no trouble making out what was going on there. Fabian Wagner then proceeds to recommend adjusting your TV setting. Now that is staggering, when the cinematographer has to tell you, the viewer, to adjust the settings on your TV in order to make out what the hell is going on in the nighttime scenes he shot. Then that is tacitly admitting, without explicitly admitting, that they indeed shot too dark. One could have lived with that if it was just a scene or two, but this is a double episode with a feature-length battle that required 55 nights and cost untold millions to film. And through that shoot, no one remembered that this would never be seen in IMAX, but in the average Schmo's home, heavily compressed for file size and streamed over an often subpar connection, or that even in the most ideal of viewing conditions, like at my place, interrupting the darkness with sudden, extremely bright flashes of dragon flame will blind the audience, thanks for that one, so they're less able to see in the darkness that immediately follows. What a tremendous waste. So, who is to blame? Wagner left no doubt about that. The showrunners and the director of the episode, who wanted it to be intense, claustrophobic, and disorienting. They certainly succeeded at the latter. In everything else, though, I would argue that they failed, and the fault for that ultimately lies with the showrunners. The cinematographer did what he was told. The director should have known better, but it was ultimately Benioff and Weiss that had to ensure what was done would not just work for, but also be viewable for the audience. The next episode didn't have the same issues of darkness, but creatively it was no better. Again, refer to Doomcock and Nerdrotic for detailed breakdowns. At this rate though, I am starting to worry that in a couple of weeks, Dexter, standing as the worst series finale of all time, might be facing some competition. So, what does this all mean for Star Wars? I used to be of the opinion that Rian Johnson's Star Wars trilogy had to be scrapped, but that the Benioff and Weiss trilogy could be amazing, just based on their work on Game of Thrones. I now see that what was good about Game of Thrones was in the books. When Benioff and Weiss ran out of books to adapt, they let it be known that, like Rian Johnson, they're all about subverting expectations to the detriment of the bigger story being told. Speaking of Rian Johnson, his response to the ultimate fate of the Night King? Sticking it to the fans. Very mature. The future of Star Wars will be determined at the summit in May. I seriously hope Bob Iger will take the most recent episodes of Game of Thrones into consideration before making any rash decisions about who gets the keys to Star Wars going forward. I hope he sees all the red flags that surround Johnson, Benioff and Weiss. The same red flags that Jeff Loeb failed to see when he hired Scott Buck for Iron Fist and the Inhumans. Because showrunners, and by extension filmmakers like that, are the last thing Star Wars needs right about now. Let me know what you think about the recent episodes of Game of Thrones, and how excited they make you about the prospect of Benioff and Weiss working with Rian Johnson on Star Wars in the comments.
If you like this video, then please help share it and share your opinion in the comments. Midnight's Edge aims to give the most comprehensive analysis and commentary on genre culture and entertainment. If you would like to see more of our videos, then please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and remember to indicate that you would like to be notified when new videos are uploaded. If you really like what we do, then please support us on Patreon until a better alternative comes along, or send us a direct donation through PayPal. Also check out our sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark for live shows and other rants. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and stay tuned for more here at Midnight's Edge.